abusive,
we've been
and I'm going to
talking.
call you out on it, okay?
Oh, I'm going to call you out many times, too.
Well, that's fine.
That's not a problem, but I'm in chairman right now, and you're out of order. Senator Murkowski.
Mr. Chairman, this is a committee that historically, I've been on this committee now for 20 years, maybe 21, I don't know. But we are a committee that I think has been viewed both internally here in the Senate and externally as a committee that really likes to focus on policy. We really like to focus on the hard things because there are hard things when it comes to how we power, how we move our country, how we can be competitive. And so I think the good debate, the hard questions are good, are fair, and I would just encourage all of us that how we approach our questions, there's a level of respect that comes with all of it. If we were really trying to get answers to the hard questions, it's how we treat one another, how we treat our witnesses with respect, and how we really try to get good value from this. I want to go back to the question that I asked, and I do apologize, Senator Hawley, because I had gone over my time. And I think we kind of took advantage of the fact that the chairman was not in his chair at that time. That's my bad. But I really do want to know the answer, and it may not be answerable. But Dr. Yergin, you have more expertise in these areas than anybody I know. You have seen us move from a country of vulnerability, great vulnerability, and exposure when it came to our oil resources, to figuring out how we then become that lead country, exercising that extraordinarily global position where we can influence what goes on with the markets. We have a role that we should be proud of in this country, and we should all, Republicans and Democrats, I don't care what administration you're part of, should want to try to encourage and continue. And unfortunately, with critical minerals, it's a little bit of deja vu all over again. We can see ourselves getting trapped in that same place where we have the resource here, but for a multitude of different reasons, far too often, it just comes down to the politics of it. We lock it off from ourselves. We make ourselves vulnerable on others, and that's a dangerous place to be, particularly at a time when we see China eating our lunch in many of these areas when it comes to the ability to process, really when it comes to mining in places where, and I agree with you, Deputy Secretary, there are places that we should not be mining. I think we know that, but we also know that we do it better, safer, cleaner here in this country. So let's figure out how we make it happen, as we did with oil, the success that fracking brought. So I raised the question, you've heard it already. We stall ourselves out by permitting issues that we haven't been able to get on top of, and despite what we did in the last measure where we said, okay, we're going to put some timelines here on EAs, that's not enough. It's not enough, and if we think that that's good enough, we're fooling ourselves. The litigation piece of it is you talk to anybody that's trying to develop oil, gas, minerals, they are baking litigation time into their project planning, into their base budget. It is a reality that is just awful. But so much of that then comes from, you got to get the social license to operate. So we're talking about it all the time. Are we just talking to ourselves? Why can't we get people in this country, young people particularly, to get what Senator King was pointing to, was that the environmental considerations here are equally important. What do we have to do? I guess I'm asking you to be the marketing man here.
Well, I think that's a pretty big question. Yeah. I think it's I think it's a question I was thinking as you're pointing this out, it's late to the party. I mean, until a few years ago, mining was something that did not attract capital, was not very interesting in the United States. It's really changed because of the discussion about energy transition and EVs, but also because of the geopolitics. So it's really an effort of catching up, and I think it is a communications thing to understand that, as the IMF, as I quoted at the beginning, says, you're not going to have the energy transition if you don't have the minerals. And that's just a fundamental factor. And I think,
But we have the minerals.
yeah.
We just need to access them.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting that I think Senator Hoeven mentioned the 7 to 10, that delays. That actually comes from a study that one of our predecessor companies did in 2015. I think it's really time that we've got to really look at that again, because I suspect that it's actually a longer time frame now. But I think this committee and what you're doing is reversing it, but it's just something that's not going to happen overnight, and mining is a long time horizon industry.
Thank you, sir. Senator Hawley.
Mr. Boudreaux, let's come back to the question of the Congo that we were talking about. So if you are opposed to the child labor practices of China in the Congo, will you support the legislation introduced by some of our colleagues in the House that would prohibit all imports of cobalt mined using child or forced labor?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that legislation.
Senator Boudreaux, if you could put your microphone so we could just put it over towards you, because I think, there you go, like that. Okay.
I'm not familiar with that legislation. I do agree with you that those types of practices are practices that we need to eliminate from our sourcing of critical minerals.
So you would support a prohibition, you would support a ban on imports in principle of any of these critical minerals that have been mined using child labor?
No, I support
Why not?
working hard to transition away from sources that use those types of practices.
Well, why not ban it? Why not say, if it's got child labor in the supply chain, we're not going to import it in this country. We're not
that
going
would
to
have
prop up
massive
child. Wait, I'm not
implications
done
for the
yet. We're not going
I'm
to.
sorry.
We're not going to prop up child labor in this country or fund it.
I think an abrupt ban would, again, I haven't studied this issue. One of the questions I would ask in connection with a ban like that would be what the impacts, including economic disruption, of such a ban would be.
Well, the impact would make slave labor and child labor extremely expensive. It would make American labor a lot more attractive. That's what it would do. It would incentivize jobs with labor protections in this country. Shouldn't we want that?
Again, I haven't reviewed that legislation. I don't know what the impacts of it would be. I agree with you that getting reliable sourcing that does not associate with those types of practices should be the goal of the United States.
But you can't agree that we should ban it.
Again, I haven't studied the legislation. It's hard for me
Well,
to
then
answer
what,
that
I guess,
question.
let me just ask you a broader question. What steps are you taking to decouple American mineral production from slave labor then?
Slave labor is completely illegal in the United States, has been since the 19th century. And so the domestic sourcing in the United States is preferable over activities like you're describing in the Congo.
But yeah, obviously. But we are reliant, as you and I talked about in our first round of questioning, we are heavily reliant on supply chains that is shot through with slave labor and child labor in China, in the Congo, elsewhere. So my question is, what are you doing to decouple us from those supply chains? You won't support a ban on child labor, so what do you propose then?
This was the purpose of the interagency working group that I chaired. This is the entire thrust of the report that we issued earlier this month, is how do we increase the reliable sourcing of these materials. I think Dr. Yergin makes an excellent point about refining as well, to decouple, again, our reliance on sources that involve practices that are abhorrent to us.
Well, all I can say is, I don't know why it makes any sense to be shutting down critical mineral supply chains in this country, shutting down mines in this country, mandating further reliance on China and other overseas supply chains that are dependent on slave labor and child labor, while workers in our country are facing the loss of their jobs. I think it's just crazy, to be honest with you. I think it's just crazy. And Mr. Chairman, I have to say in conclusion, you may not like my questions, but I'm going to keep asking them. I made a commitment to the people of my state. I'm going to come right here. I'm going to be a bulldog. I'm going to ask the questions, and you can interrupt me as much as you want, cut me off, take my time away, but I promise you I'm not going to stop.
I would never do. Let me just tell you one thing. I agree with what you're saying. I just don't like the way you say it. How's that?
That's your right, but you know
We
what?
have a different.
I'm going to keep on keeping on.
Here's the thing. We all agree.